OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 11. The Museum of Time. While OverSoul 7 was concentrating on George Bainbridge's problems, he was, of course, simultaneously involved with all of his other personalities as well. Since he had a body to contend with, too, this demanded a multiplication of focus that 7 was still in the process of perfecting. He was also having experiences with his teacher, Cypress, who was monitoring his actions from her own impeccable viewpoint. For example, even as George Bainbridge was saying to Dr. Josephine Biff, "Maybe we can find John Window before anyone realizes he's missing," OverSoul 7 suddenly heard Cypress's voice, and when he did, he managed to stay in Josephine's office, nodding his head, he hoped, in the right places, while his main consciousness formed a small bit of light that was played on the ceiling. Cypress was another spot of light dancing at the top of the window. "None of this will do at all," Cypress said. She moved at the speed of light, of course, as did 7, so their conversation took hardly any time at all. "I know it won't do," 7 cried. "Where have you been? Just tell me where Window is, that's all, and I'll straighten things out somehow." Cypress sighed. "You know I can't tell you," she said. "That would be cheating." "So cheat," 7 replied. "Look at George. He's half out of his mind. He doesn't even understand miracles." Cypress smiled, looking down at the rumpled George, who was wiping the perspiration from his face and saying, "I bet that damn Gregory Diggs took Window somewhere to protect him." The physical 7 nodded vigorously, yet to Cypress and 7's consciousness, the motions and sounds of the room were incredibly slow. "But why?" Josephine asked. "I see what you mean," Cypress said sympathetically. "I'll give you some hints. First, remember the message you received earlier about the codicils. They're vitally important. And remember that all of your personalities are involved in one way or another with the activities of any one of them. And in Earth terms, of course, you do have a deadline." "A deadline?" 7 asked, more uneasy than ever. "Oh, 7, just find Window," Cypress said softly. "I'll give you another clue. Follow your impulses. And in physical terms, hurry. You do know where he is." "I do?" 7 said wonderingly. But instantly he was fully back in his body, which George Bainbridge was nudging with his elbow. "Come on, let's get going," George demanded. Almost teetering on her high-heeled sandals, Josephine Blythe said, with bitter amusement, "Yeah, we're off to see the Wizard of Oz." "Super," 7 said, complimenting himself on making a suitable reply under somewhat confusing conditions. The conditions became even more confused and disorganized, 7 thought, as the afternoon progressed. First, they searched the psych center as nonchalantly as possible for Window or for Gregory Diggs. When this failed, they all piled into George's Porsche and began driving up and down the streets in hopes of sighting one or the other. "If we drive up and down past this shopping center one more time, I'll go crazy," Josephine said finally. "We've been everywhere around town with no sign of either of them. For all we know, they're on a bus to Timbuktu or somewhere." We don't even know for sure if they're together." She sighed. Her makeup was cracking from the heat, her shoes hurt, and she didn't like being crowded so close to George Bainbridge in the car's front seat. From the small back seat, Seven said, "Let's park and talk a minute. Maybe we can think of a plan of action. Park in front of your place, George. Why don't you? Where it's cool." Seven didn't know why he mentioned parking in front of George's, but the minute he did, he remembered the odd time transfers that had happened in the spot where George's house stood. "Follow your impulses," Cypress had said. Was that what she meant? "It's okay with me," George replied with weary resignation. Josephine eased one shoe off and rubbed one heel with the other one. They pulled up in front of George's house. "I don't see the point of this," Josephine said with a worried air. "We're just not getting any place." Seven was tempted to agree. "Hell, we'll find him sometime," George replied with conviction. "If he's in town, that is." But Seven was suddenly alert. George's words made brilliant sense. "We'll find him some time," Seven thought. Of course. "Your car windows need a good washing," Josephine said, or something to say, and Seven stared at her. Did she realize what else her words meant besides what they were saying? Probably not. But when Josephine said the word windows, Seven was suddenly reminded of someone he'd entirely forgotten. "Well, not entirely, of course," he said later to Cypress. He remembered another man, one whose name was Window, a personality of his who was in the 23rd century, the last time Seven checked. And John Window was like an unclear version of the 23rd century Window. He was, Seven thought with sudden inspiration, like a window that needed cleaning because it was distorting a view. "Yeah, I know. I'll clean 'em before Jean comes home," George said. "She always complains about that, too." In that moment, Seven knew that something was going to happen, and he didn't want George or Josephine around when it did. On impulse, he opened the car door and squeezed himself out. "I think I'll sit on the porch a while," he said, a bit apologetically. "The heat's really getting to me. It's getting toward supper time, but I'm not even hungry. Why don't you two get a bite and pick me up afterward? In the meantime, I'll think a lot," he said, borrowing one of George's pet phrases. Josephine shook her head. "No food for me, but I think we should check the center again. George can look outside, and I'll go in on some pretext or other." Seven nodded impatiently because he could already feel times changing. The car turned the corner just as the road itself disappeared. Seven sprang to his feet as the house behind him disappeared. So did just about everything else. In a bewildering display, objects again appeared, disappeared, and were replaced by others. Finally, Seven remembered a knack of dealing with such events, one that he'd learned somewhere, when, and forgotten. He stared directly ahead, and when the next object, a small tree, appeared there, Seven kept his gaze riveted on the spot. Everything disappeared again, and now the tree was taller. So he was going into the future. At least he had that settled, he thought. And he wanted to find Window of the 23rd century to see what connections there were between him and his namesake in the 20th century. If he found the future window, would he automatically find the 20th century one? 7 was blinking furiously. The tree was full grown, then dead. Then the spot was vacant. A hut appeared, then the spot was empty again. Then new growth. 7 groaned. The spot looked more or less the way it had when he'd found himself in the 25th century with the floating cities. If so, he'd gone 2 centuries too far. But before he could think of anything to do about this, the environment began to stabilize. He looked up, his suspicions confirmed. The landscape looked more or less deserted, and in the sky the floating cities caught the rays of the sun like glittering round kites. 7 gulped. Something decidedly unpleasant had happened in this latest time change. Instead of grass, the ground was covered with a sickly brown layer of vegetation that almost looked like the thin wisps of hair on a bald man's head. And beneath, the ground was almost gray in color. The only trees were dwarfed, crooked ones, hardly 3 feet tall at most, and though the air was warm enough, meaning it was still summer, there were no flowers or birds or— 7 listened intently, or insects, or if there were, they were ominously still. As he looked about, OverSoul 7 felt a deepening sense of desolation. Here, in the very spot where George Bainbridge's house stood in easy hearing distance of the busy traffic of Water Street, where the busy 20th century air was full of activity, now, in the 25th century, all that had vanished. The earth, for all purposes, was a deserted, sterile world. 7 let his consciousness roam. While he stood disconsolately, his mind traveled over the nearly blank landscape. In the flash of a human eye, 7's consciousness leapt from continent to continent. Even the seas were sluggish, and the vegetation had slogged off the mountains so that only here or there one lonely dwarf tree remained. What had happened? 7 was almost overwhelmed by the desolation. He was an earth soul after all. So what if some mortals dwelled in the manufactured cities above the earth? What heritages had been lost? What physical echoes no longer sounded in the blood? Window wouldn't be found here, 7 realized suddenly. This world had no inhabitants. Then where was the precise future probability that Window belonged in? Besides, wasn't Window in the 23rd century, not the 25th? Then why had he come here? 7 wondered. Cyprus, he knew, would say, "Trust yourself, even your seeming mistakes." But what good would that do? 7 nervously looked around again. He wanted to get out of this probability as quickly as possible. But maybe the century was somehow right, even though he was positive that Window had been in the 23rd century last time he remembered. Scowling, 7 stared directly before him again, this time at a spindly, dead gray twig. Probabilities, he knew, were like tangents out from a certain time. They were horizontal extensions, sort of. So he stared at the twig and stared and stared. Finally, it began to blur just a bit. At the same time, he felt as if he were just looking through his right eye, or tipping very gently sidewards to the right, or leaning psychologically to the right. At least this is how he tried to explain it to himself as everything, ground, sky, 7, and all his thoughts, suddenly took a turn in one probability and shifted into another. The time was still the 25th century, for the 3 floating cities still hung in the sky. The twig, or its double or triple, was now infinitesimally to the right of the first one. The distance was so small it could never be physically measured, but Seven knew he was in a different world. This became apparent at once as new objects kept appearing everywhere, so quickly that Seven leapt back. When he did, something struck his leg or his leg struck something, and he spun around, rubbing his eyes with momentary disbelief. There stood what looked at first to be George Bainbridge's house in the 20th century, and what he'd brushed up against was the hitching post that George had kept from his grandfather's time as a decoration, only now it was to the right of the porch, just by the steps, and stood out by the curb. The house itself was even more confusing, for it resembled George's so completely, and yet glaring distortions or differences were everywhere. It looked to be of brick, yet at the same time it appeared to be made of some much lighter material. The 3 windows were right in the front waiting room, but there were also 3 windows on the left side, where Seven was sure George's house had only 2. Besides that, though, this house looked newly constructed, or too good to be true, or somehow unused. Seven stepped back to get a better look, and then saw the neat sign. It read, "The Ancient House of Many Windows," believed to be a perfect replica of a structure that actually stood in this spot roughly from 1860 to 2010. The original Tell, explored in the 23rd century, delivered artifacts that led historical designers to begin their detailed assessment of the structure. Later excavations gave further data. The discovery of the original codicils was made only 5 years ago, when an ancient bomb shelter was evacuated at a deeper level. This People's Museum is open to the public. Further information on the codicils inside. The codicils? Seven could hardly contain his excitement. Yet he was uneasy because no one was about. He sat down on the steps, looking toward the river. The river bank had changed. The odd dikes built in George's time were now buried under new topsoil. The river must have flooded many times and then widened somehow, for now it ran deeper and wider below a high bank of planted shrubbery and trees. Seven saw no roads, only natural, well-tended paths, and he realized that he was in the middle of a park area. The surroundings were so pleasant that he was almost tempted to walk down to the river, but he sighed and walked up the steps to the museum's porch. Hesitantly, he opened the front door. It was far lighter in weight than George's 20th century door, even though the material looked the same. No sooner had the door opened and Seven glimpsed the layout of the rooms off the hall than a man's figure appeared coming down the front stairwell. "Good afternoon," the man said. "You've missed the tour scheduled the past hour. I can give you a private tour, however, although it won't be as extensive as the group one. Will you follow me, please?" Seven was confused, at least momentarily. The man vaguely reminded him of the 23rd century window, with his long, severe nose and intent eyes. But there was no consciousness involved at all with this figure, even though it was 3-dimensional. Before Seven could comment, the man came closer, turned in a graceful circle so that Seven could see his back, faced Seven again, and said with quiet authority, "I am Monarch, appearing as a hologram and acting as your guide." "A hologram? I should have known at once," Seven said. It was impossible not to admire the hologram. The skin, hair, eyes, everything in fact, was perfect, and the illusion of depth was flawless. Seeing Monarch's face, or rather the image of it, Seven was almost certain that the hologram's original was also Window of the 23rd century. Not that the features were the same, but that Seven kept seeing Window's features superimposed over the holograms. When Seven didn't move to follow him, the hologram man said, "Have you a question? Technology is advanced so that I can answer almost any question that a tourist might ask, though. Where is the real Window? I mean Monarch." "In his study. He's the force behind the excavations and the construction of this museum. Appointments may be arranged. His administration building is a mile away, taking the western footpath which is clearly marked. Now, if you'll step into the next room," this, it is believed, was an ancient dentist's office. Seven took one startled glance at the open doorway through which he saw what was supposed to be a reconstructed version of George's dentist chair. At once he saw that it was the mismatched combination of such chairs from at least 4 different historical periods, all put together in one. Just inside the door was a table bearing dental tools from both the 19th and 20th centuries, and the label by them read, "Dental Instruments." Seven paused. "Sir," said the hologram man. "I haven't time for a tour," Seven said impatiently. "I have to find Window. Thanks for your intention. Super." "I beg your pardon," said the hologram man. "I'm not familiar with the meaning of the last term in that context." But Seven was gone, and when the door closed, the hologram man was deactivated as the laser beams that formed his image disappeared. As he left the museum, Seven wondered if he should have found out what the codicils were. He knew Cyprus had said that they were vitally important, but it was imperative that he find John Window. And if he was right, a big if, Seven reminded himself, then maybe Window, or Monarch, and this future probability would somehow help him find 20th century Window. Seven found the western path with no difficulty. As he walked along as fast as he couldn't forget that this same spot of footpaths and tall shady trees existed in the space where Water Street and Walnut Street intersected. No, he realized, in the 20th century reality, he would have already turned and walked up Walnut Street. And somewhere in that area, George Bainbridge and Dr. Josephine Blythe were cruising around in George's car, looking for John Window. Seven hoped he could get the whole thing straight. He could hear himself later telling Cyprus that this had been the most complicated venture she had ever sent him on. The fantasy in his mind faded, though, as he finally approached a large stone building with many verandas. Seven shook his head. This was a beautiful but hardly faithful replica of the old Christian Science church that sat on the corner of Church and Walnut Streets in George's time. A small plaque read, "Administration Building." Was Window? Seven caught himself. Monarch inside? There was only one way to find out. Seven walked up the steps, and the door automatically opened. As Seven stepped over the door sill, he saw Monarch sitting at the end of a long, wide corridor. 7 quickly recognized him as the model of the hologram man. But more than that, 7's consciousness merged at once with Monarch's, and, joyfully, 7 realized that Monarch and Window were the same and yet different. They were counterparts of each other, living in different times and yet more connected than brothers. And that meant, of course, 7 thought, John Window was also one of his own personalities, a counterpart of the others, and he had let himself forget these connections so that the various personalities would be free to seek their own ways unless or until they needed his help. And now they did. But as soon as 7 recognized Monarch as the 25th century Window and made other connections, and even as Monarch looked up with a glance of polite inquiry, the objects and space itself began to shimmer again, wrinkle into itself, blink off and on until, blinking himself, 7 found himself standing inside the 20th century Christian Science church, in the reading room, staring at the startled John Window and Gregory Diggs. "How on earth did you find us here? I've never even been in a church in my life before," Gregory Diggs said, and 7 appeared in the doorway. "It's a long story," 7 replied. He felt relieved, surprised, and out of breath. "Verily," Window replied. "He's Christ again," Gregory said, "and I'm going to see that nobody takes advantage of him." 7 shook his head. It was still hot, and his polyester suit wasn't even wrinkled. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Diggs scowled defensively. "I'm showing Christ here that some people believe that healing is natural. He doesn't have to be afraid either because, well, these people say there isn't no evil either. They left bulletins at the center, so I thought we'd see what they had to offer. Nobody's going to crucify you either, because—" Diggs said this last to John Window, who now believed he was Christ again, and Window stared sorrowfully at OverSoul 7 and said, "Are you Judas? Have you come to betray me?" "Jesus Christ," Diggs said under his breath to 7. Now see what you've done? Will you get out of here?" "Hurry, run to the door and drag Window with you," 7 cried. "If my deductions are right, George's car should be passing this place right now." Diggs, grunting, pushing the unhappy Window to the door, 7 threw it open, and George's car was right out front, in the very spot where Monarch's door opened in the 25th century. Josephine saw the trio at once and told George to stop the car. They all piled in and drove off. In Chapter 11, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha.